Who can say when it's safe to return to a country that has been at war for 10 years? Well, Denmark is telling some refugees they should go back to Syria. And other countries may well do the same. Is this about getting rid of unwanted foreigners, or is it only fair that they should go home if they can? This is Roundtable. Hello and a warm welcome from me, David Foster. Denmark has been roundly criticised for its decision, but it says it made it very plain to the refugees when they arrived that their stay would only be temporary. Denmark has stripped 94 Syrian refugees of their residency permits, saying that Damascus and its surrounding areas are now safe to return to. The Syrians who had residency revoked will not be forced to leave Denmark, but they would have to abandon homes, studies, and jobs to live in deportation camps. The apparent aim of this state of legal limbo is to compel them to return to Syria voluntarily. Human rights groups such as Amnesty International have criticized Denmark's policy as an affront to the basic right of being safe from persecution. It's now 10 years since the war in Syria began. A recent United Nations report said thousands of civilians had endured unimaginable suffering at the hands of the Syrian regime, including torture and death in detention. Will Denmark's decision pave the way for other European countries to follow suit, effectively rehabilitating Syria's dictator, President Assad? Well, I'm delighted to be able to welcome for this edition of Roundtable out of Copenhagen, Denmark, Sune Haugbolle, Middle East researcher and professor in global studies at Roskilde University in Denmark. We go to Berlin, where we see Dr. Bente Scheller, who was once in the German embassy in Damascus and is from the Middle East section of the Heinrich Böll Foundation. And in London, we see Steve Valdez-Symonds, the Refugee and Migrants Rights Director at Amnesty International UK. Steve, let me kick off with you. Does Denmark's decision mean the war in Syria is over?
Well, I think that would be highly premature, but what's most important is that it's extremely premature to think that the brutality in Syria is over for Syrians. Whatever happens in respect of the war, the simple fact is that Assad still runs an extremely brutal regime, and it is not safe to be suggesting that Syrians can safely return there at this time.
Let's hear from the Danish Immigration Minister, Mathias Tesfaye. I'm going to read out what he had to say. We've made it clear to the Syrian refugees that their residence permit is temporary. It can be withdrawn if protection is no longer needed. We must give people protection for as long as is needed. But when conditions in the home country improve, a former refugee should return home and re-establish a life there. Again, to you, Steve, he seems to be suggesting that it is okay to go back.
Well, we know that that is just a false situation. We have a number of reports of people who have been being compelled effectively to return to Syria over recent months and indeed years, largely from neighboring countries. And we know that they don't find safety back in Syria. We know the brutality of the regime continues. And so it's particularly shocking that a European nation should be now effectively adding to the incentives for countries closer to Syria to continue in that vein.
Okay, Bente, let me come to you. You worked in Damascus. It was a number of years ago, but in your current job, you're presumably in touch with people across the Middle East, talking to some contacts, those who are willing to speak to you in Syria itself. What do they tell you about safety concerns and conditions there?
Well, those of my contacts who remain in Damascus obviously chose to do so. They never wanted to flee, but they have more and more doubts about whether this was the right decision, because security is an issue. They had a minimum of security, they felt, because of who they were, because of where they came from. which family background they had, and they always felt if they don't stick out their head too far, they can stay. But arbitrary violence is the tool for the Syrian regime. For them, it is very important that no Syrian ever feels safe, and this is why my contacts now are telling me they feel it's worse than ever before. Obviously, the socioeconomic situation is also contributing to them having more doubts about their future, but they feel how persecution, how harassment is happening on a daily basis and how it is coming closer even to them.
The assessment has been made by the Danish authorities that it is safe for these people to go back. But is it possible that because they have fled the country in the first place, they are more visible and that they therefore are assumed to have grievances against the Assad regime and that they will be targets?
Sure. I mean, the regime has always had the strategy of looking who else is in your family, what your family members did during the war, during the uprising, and they have been punishing and harassing people for this. And from the very place they are from, I read about some of the refugees who now are supposed to return from Denmark. They come from places like Jobar. I mean, Jobar was completely depopulated because of the role it took in the uprising. Jobar was attacked with chemical weapons before. These people very safely return. It will not be possible for them until Assad is gone. With him, it is clear they will always be suspected of having been opposed to him and of continuing to oppose him. And therefore, for them, there is no safety in Syria, not as long as Assad and his regime are there.
And yet the only remaining war zone is the city of Idlib.
This is because the regime has not been able so far to bring it down. If they would have had the possibility, they definitely would have. But I mean, it has been mentioned by the colleague from Amnesty. The war is not the most threatening factor for most Syrians, but the political war that is being fought, the arrests and whatever, like forcible disappearances are such a big problem. A few years ago, a list was released, or it was leaked by the regime, of 1.4 million people who are wanted. I mean, just imagine that with a population of 20 million. And I mean, this number will have increased since then. So we cannot say for anybody that it's safe to return. And some of those who voluntarily return, they thought they had guarantees that nothing will happen to them. But then after they arrived to Damascus, nothing was ever heard of them. We have these reports as well. So there is no way that we can guarantee somebody's safety once he enters Syria.
Sune, let me come to you and go back to that quote from the immigration minister. We made it clear that this was only temporary, and the 94 refugees who've been told that they should go back to Syria, or if they don't want to go back to Syria, they should be in deportation camps, presumably have had their claims for asylum dismissed. They never expected, the Danish people, for them to stay.
Right. I mean, there is this issue of what to do with these people who've come to Denmark. Denmark has taken in a number of refugees like other European countries. And sure, they're there temporarily. And when the situation changes, then they can be returned. That's all legal. Now, the question really is, I mean, the big issue is whether the situation is safe and stable enough to return to Syria. The reason why Denmark could be a potential front runner, if you want, a first European country to go ahead with the forced return of Syrian refugees, is this report that the Danish authorities produced 2 years ago. And this is a very problematic report, I have to say, as someone who's lived and worked in Syria and follows the situation very closely. It focuses on the issue of military safety, that there's a certain stability in terms of the military fighting having stopped in and around Damascus, which is the case, but it doesn't really address legal security, what has happened, what could happen to people when they return, if they've had some sort of history with the regime, or even if they haven't. I mean, they might be seen as suspects just for having left the country. So the Danish authorities have chosen not to address that issue. And in doing so, I think there are in contravention or potential contravention of international conventions, in particular the Convention Against Torture. And the issue, I mean, the point of non-refoulement, the fact that you can't send back people refugees to a country where they might be in danger of torture and human rights abuse.
Yeah, I tell you what I'm going to do at this
that's the
particular
problem.
point. I'll come back to you in just a second. Just before or just after, around about the same time anyway, as the Danish decision was announced, there was a UN inquiry on conditions in Syria. It talked about torture, electric shocks, burning of body parts, crucifixion, etc., etc. And this was one particular thing that Hani Megali, a member of the inquiry, had to say.
The first things that emerge from the review is that arbitrary detention was used to punish critics, to punish opponents, and it was used by everyone, but primarily by the Syrian state, and it was used on a massive scale. It was also used to intimidate and to terrorize the population at large.
Steve, you say this is a reckless violation of Denmark's duty to provide asylum, but these people were not granted asylum. They were not thought to be genuine asylum seekers. Even with the conditions laid out in the United Nations, what obligation does Denmark have other than perhaps a misty moral one?
Well, I don't think we've quite got the position correct in our discussion so far. My understanding is Denmark is saying that, yes, people were, it says, real refugees from Syria, no dispute about that. It's just saying that the time has come, that the circumstances have changed so that people are no longer in need of protection, so are now can be ceased to be refugees. And what the report that you've just read from, along with so much else, shows is that it is just reckless at this time to be suggesting that Syria is indeed a safe place for refugees to return to. It's just simply wrong to suggest that this is a safe regime. And we know that both from what the UN has said, from reports from Amnesty International, and reports from so many other human rights bodies that have looked at the situation in Syria. So that's the problem. Denmark is suggesting that things have become safe for people, and there is just no real serious evidence to suggest that.
Yeah, I was just simply making the distinction between those who are refugees and those who've had asylum applications turned down, and it is those who've had the applications turned down that have been asked to go back, asked in a certain way. There are concerns that other countries in Europe will be watching what is happening in Denmark. Bente, anywhere in particular?
Well, you probably noticed that also the German ministers of interior recently did not extend the ban on deportations to Syria. They restricted the possibility of sending people back to criminals and to fundamentalists. And they said, well, this is only like 90 people, but I mean, that's quite a change that you announced, that it will be possible. I mean, human rights are human rights. You cannot send anybody to a context in which their human rights will not be respected. And therefore, the decision is very questionable anyway. And of course, I think it is a door opener, the same as well as Denmark might be a front runner. This might be an additional step in other countries of Europe following suit. And we have seen other countries that are more interested in normalizing relations with Assad. For example, Hungary or Poland have not been as strict, and they're insisting that there cannot be relations with Assad and that there cannot be reconstruction as long as Assad is there. And of course, for these, it will be an encouragement to see this kind of populist attempts to withdraw refugee status and to claim that Syria has become safer. It is definitely not safer, as has just been explained.
Sune, I will come to you in just a moment, but I want to go back to Steve for this particular point. Is it your contention that anybody who flees a country where there is danger on a refugee basis should never have to go back? They should always be able to stay at their final destination?
Well, if circumstances don't change. I mean, the fundamentals that European nations are committed to, or so they say, is that nobody should be sent to a place where they will face torture, inhuman or degrading treatment. And nobody, frankly, can safely say that Syrians at this time are not at risk of that if they were returned to Syria now. So if European nations are going to uphold the rights that they say they believe in, then what Denmark is proposing must not at this time happen. Of course, Amnesty doesn't say that there can never be a time when a refugee may be expected to return to a country from which they fled if, but only if, that country truly is safe, and Syria is not.
Well, you'll have to tell me a little bit later on how one makes that judgment. So now let me come to you. A member of the Danish opposition has suggested that conversations should be had with President Assad about guaranteeing safety. Is that at all realistic?
No, it's not, and I think that member of parliament was put in his place by his own party, the opposition party, the former ruling party of Venstre, simply because Denmark doesn't recognize the Assad government and hasn't since the beginning of the war, like the rest of the EU, as the legitimate rulers of Syria, and so they would again then be the first European country to do that, and we're not ready to do that. And neither Venstre nor the Social Democrats or any of the other mainstream political parties in Denmark. So I think that was more a way of floating an idea, again, sort of pushing the boundaries a little bit. This is not going to happen right now. Also, Denmark is not going to forcefully send these people home. This is also not, there's no political backing for doing that. The conversation is really about nudging them and pushing them towards leaving. They've been taken away their status, these 90-something people, asylum status, and will now be sent to exit centers in Denmark, where they are supposed to remain within the parameters of these centers, and the conditions there are very, very questionable. I mean, that's another level of human rights issues, I think, where Denmark is towing the line of international conventions. And I'm sad to say this because it pains me as a Danish citizen, but I think we have a real problem here in the way that we're treating the refugees. Again, because they're not supposed to stay in these centers for more than 6 months, according to international human rights law, and sometimes they are, and they're left in a real limbo. We can't send them back, and they can't really leave these centers either.
You say they're trying to persuade them to return, that it's not compulsory, but they go to deportation centers where, if I'm right, they don't have full-time jobs, their children don't have full-time education, their prospects are very, very limited indeed. So they're caught between two stools here.
Right, exactly. And those are very depressing places. I mean, it's been covered quite well in the Danish press. So I think there's that level of nudging, but the other level of nudging is to offer quite generous repatriation packages of the kind that Germany has also offered Syrian refugees. And I think we've seen in some cases of German Syrian refugees who have returned with the refugee compensation packages and then have proceeded to disappear back in Syria. So I don't think that's completely safe either in terms of the human rights situation.
Sorry, let me clarify. When you say disappear, you mean they're no longer visible to the authorities, or they are the desaparecidos? You know, officially they're still alive, but they probably aren't.
Right, exactly. And reports of them being taken by the authorities.
Okay, Bente, go into some detail about what Sune has just mentioned there, Germany's attitude towards repatriation and the money that's being offered. Has it been taken up?
It has been very few people who accepted it. It is there. It's like 1,200 euros that are available for repatriation if you return voluntarily. But even though that might be an interesting sum for some people, I think it is less than 1,000 people who have accepted this over the past 3 years. And that tells you something about whether it is a good idea or not. I would also add that it might be a further incentive for the regime to endanger these people. We have seen over the past years that the regime has been trying to really squeeze the last bit of money out of whatever it could get its hands on. And so if it is known that Syrian refugees are equipped with money or goods or any kind of assets that might encourage the regime to press families of those, some have still families in Syria, so these might get under threat because of this, and of course those returnees also.
Okay, Steve, let me come to you. Going further afield, what would other countries that have taken the bulk of the refugees, if you like, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan be making of what they're seeing in certain European countries?
I think this is all extremely dangerous. We know that over the entirety of the last few years, really, at different times, Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon have pressed Syrians, forced Syrians back to Syria. Now, that isn't to take away the fact that those three countries are host to populations of Syrian refugees that, frankly, should be embarrassing to most of the countries in Europe who are certainly not supporting populations of anything like such a size. It is extremely reckless to be sending the signal to, for example, Lebanon, that European countries think that the time has come for compelling refugees back to Syria. If Lebanon and Jordan were to step up the sorts of efforts that they have made to press upon Syrians to do so, one of the things that might well happen, and Europe could well expect, would be a significantly new displacement of Syrians from the region, seeking to escape the prospect of being forced back from countries on Syria's border.
Okay, Bente, are Syrians in Germany, and Germany did take quite a lot, are they worried about what they're seeing in Denmark and the talk that is going on in Europe about being sent back to Syria?
I think many got worried because of that, because it is not very clear why this happens. First, the Foreign Office publishes, or it doesn't publish, but it is known that there is a report by the Foreign Office clearly stating it is not safe to return, and then there is this decision of the Ministers of Interior. So that is scary for many who can't really see what it means for them personally. There is also quite a number that still has been waiting for family reunification, and of course they also perceive this as a sign not only that the future for them might be under threat in Germany, but they think their family reunification by that also will never happen. So it has been quite worrisome for many. And then, I mean, one aspect that we shouldn't forget, I looked at the rhetorics of the regime and I looked at their policies towards the neighboring states. The Syrian regime clearly does not want people to return. Many Syrian refugees would like to return if conditions were in a way that they felt they could risk it. But the Syrian regime has clearly said it does not want these people back. Security services have said this, people from the military, from the culture, from the parliament. There are plenty of statements that indicate they don't want them back. And this is what Lebanon also shows. The pressure from Lebanon to send refugees back has been there to an extent that it has said it might normalize relations with the Assad regime. It has never happened. And this is something we should really think about. We bring refugees in a terrible situation when we start pushing them back, but even before, what a mental burden. And after all, they already survived. But we say we withdraw the ground from beneath their feet, even though, in fact, nothing has changed. And we do this just for motives that are in our own interior policy. This is really dangerous.
Whether Syria can actually manage without the millions of people, countrymen and women and children who have fled the country is another question. We will talk about that probably on another occasion. But Sune, let me ask you, is Denmark feeling the heat, the pressure, the criticism, or will it go ahead with this?
I don't think it can go ahead. I think what it will do. I mean, there is a lot of pandering to populist sentiments, and this happens across the board for the political parties, including the governing party. So I think sending signals is a big part of it. Some parts of the population do want to get rid of refugees, and this is a fact in I think all of Europe. But the Danish government also has to live up to international conventions that it's a signature of, and for that simple reason, I think it's not going to happen. But it puts people in a terrible situation, like Bente said. Psychologically, there's a lot of strain on them. The threat of having their status changed, maybe their rights even in Denmark changed, and being forced to live in these deportation centers is quite a terrible thing. But I don't foresee that Denmark is going to change their relations with the Assad regime as the first European country, and therefore they effectively can't force people back.
Yeah, we're talking about 94 refugees here going to these deportation centres. I'm guessing there have been others, but how many refugees have been given permanent residency? How well have they assimilated? And are there legitimate reasons to be upset if you happen to be a Dane about some of the people who have arrived?
Well, I mean, this has been a huge issue for the last 30 years in Denmark. We've had one of the first right-wing anti-immigration parties was the Danish People's Party, one of the first in Europe to really win big parts of support in the population. And this comes from, a certain feeling in some parts of the population that immigrants can't necessarily assimilate very well. Many do.
Indeed, I'm sorry to cut you short, but we've run out of time. 5.6 million Syrian refugees there are. Will many of those ever be able to go home? Well, listen, thank you very much indeed for coming on this edition of Roundtable. Very much appreciate your time. And wherever you are watching, I'm David Foster from me and the team. Thank you for your company. We hope to have you with us next time. Until then, a very goodbye.